You've probably said this sentence out loud at some point: inflation is out of control, everything's so expensive right now. But here's a question: do you actually know the difference between inflation and the cost of living? Because most people use those two words like they're the same thing. They're not. And mixing them up might be the reason you're making the wrong money decisions right now. In this video, we're untangling inflation from cost of living once and for all. We'll break down what each one actually measures, run through real numbers so it's not abstract, bust a myth that trips up almost everyone, and walk through a case study with two people living in the exact same city on the exact same income. By the end, you'll never mix these two up again. Quick disclaimer: I'm not a financial advisor. This isn't financial advice, just breaking down concepts so you can think clearly about your own money. Let's get into it. Think about a birthday party. Inflation is like the price of the whole party going up. The cake, the balloons, the venue, all of it on average across the country. Cost of living is more like your family's actual grocery bill for that specific party in your specific neighborhood based on what you personally buy. Inflation, technically, is the rate at which the general price level of goods and services rises across an entire economy over time. It's usually measured using something like the Consumer Price Index, which tracks a broad basket of goods, food, housing, transportation, healthcare, and reports one national average number. Cost of living is different. It's what it actually costs you specifically to maintain your standard of living in your specific location. Two people can experience the exact same national inflation rate and have wildly different costs of living because one lives in a small town and the other lives in a major city where rent alone eats a huge chunk of income. So what actually determines the number you hear on the news? That's inflation, a national average. What determines whether you personally feel squeezed every month? That's cost of living, deeply personal and local. There's actually a helpful subsplit here too. Economists sometimes distinguish headline inflation, which includes everything in that basket, from core inflation, which strips out food and energy prices because those tend to swing wildly month to month. Neither of those, headline or core, is designed to capture your personal cost of living. They're both still national averages, just sliced slightly differently. Let's make this concrete. Say the national inflation rate for the year comes in around 3%. That means, on average, a basket of goods that cost $100 last year now costs roughly $103 this year, nationally. But imagine you live in a city where rent has jumped 8% because of local housing shortages, while your grocery bill barely moved. Your personal cost of living just went up way more than that national 3% figure, even though technically inflation is still reported at 3%. Now imagine your friend in a different, more affordable city, where rent barely moved and groceries got slightly cheaper due to local competition between stores. Their cost of living might have barely budged or even dropped a little in that same year, while the national inflation number stayed identical for both of you. Same inflation rate, two completely different lived experiences. That gap is the whole point. Here's the myth I want to bust. If inflation is low, my cost of living should feel manageable. That's not necessarily true. Inflation measures the rate of change in prices, how fast things are getting more expensive. It doesn't measure the actual level of prices where you live, and it doesn't measure your specific spending habits. You could be living through a period of historically low inflation and still feel financially squeezed because prices were already high in your area before that low inflation period even started, or because your income hasn't kept pace with your specific local expenses. Low inflation doesn't mean things are cheap, it just means things aren't getting more expensive quite as fast as they were. Let's meet Ingrid and Colin. Ingrid lives in a high-cost coastal city. Her rent is a huge chunk of her paycheck, her grocery store options are limited and pricier, and parking alone costs her more than some people's entire transportation budget. National inflation this year is reported at 3%. Colin lives in a mid-sized inland city. His rent is a fraction of Ingrid's, groceries are noticeably cheaper because of more competition between stores, and he doesn't pay for parking at all. Same national inflation rate, 3%. Both of them read the same headline: inflation holds steady at 3% this year. Ingrid feels like prices are crushing her budget. Colin barely notices a difference in his monthly spending. Neither of them is wrong about their own experience. They're just experiencing two completely different costs of living layered on top of one identical national inflation number. Here's the twist. Imagine Ingrid gets a job offer in Collins City at a lower salary than she currently makes. On paper, taking a pay cut sounds like a bad move. But once you factor in her dramatically lower cost of living in the new city, she could end up with more money left over every month than she has right now, despite the smaller paycheck. That's the entire reason cost of living matters, just as much as your raw income number, maybe more. This distinction matters enough that major financial institutions build entire tools around it. Rockefeller Capital Management and similar wealth advisory firms regularly point out that cost of living differences between cities can be dramatic enough to completely change the math on whether a raise, a relocation, or a job offer is actually a good deal, even when national inflation stays completely flat. It's a big part of why cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, exist in salaries and benefits at all, because a flat national inflation number genuinely doesn't reflect what people are experiencing city to city. Let's be balanced about how useful each of these numbers actually is. Understanding inflation, pros, it helps you make sense of interest rate decisions, it explains why your savings account needs to earn something just to keep up, and it gives you a useful national benchmark for comparing this year to last year. Understanding inflation, cons, on its own, it tells you almost nothing about your personal budget. Two people in different cities can have the same inflation exposure and completely different financial realities. Understanding cost of living, pros. It's the number that actually matters for your day-to-day decisions: where to live, whether to take a job, how much cushion you need in your budget. Understanding cost of living, cons. It's harder to track cleanly because it's personal. It changes based on your specific choices, and there's no single clean headline number for it the way there is with inflation. Here's why this mix-up matters more than it seems. When people hear inflation is low on the news but still feel like they're struggling financially, it creates a strange kind of self-doubt, like something must be wrong with them personally, when actually it's just a mismatch between a national average and their specific local reality. That's not a personal failure, that's a data gap. On the flip side, when inflation is reported as high nationally, people sometimes panic about their personal finances even if their specific cost of living barely moved that year, because their expenses are concentrated in categories that didn't spike much. Confusing the national number with your personal number can trigger anxiety that isn't actually matched by your real financial situation, or blind you to a real squeeze that the national number is hiding. This is a version of anchoring bias, leaning too heavily on the first number you hear, the national headline, instead of checking it against your own actual bank statements. The fix isn't complicated. It's just underused. Track your own spending in the categories that matter to you, and treat the national inflation number as context, not as a verdict on your personal finances. So which number should you actually pay attention to? Honestly, it depends on what decision you're making. If you're trying to understand interest rates, savings account yields, or the broader economy, inflation is the right lens. If you're trying to decide where to live, whether to take a new job, or how to budget month to month, your personal cost of living matters far more, and it might not match the national headline at all. The real takeaway isn't to ignore inflation, it's to stop assuming it tells you the whole story about your own wallet. If this cleared up the inflation versus cost of living confusion for you, drop a like. It really helps this channel out. And I want to know in the comments, has your city's cost of living ever felt totally disconnected from what the news says about inflation? Let me know your experience below. If you want to go deeper on how interest rates and inflation actually connect, I've got a video breaking that down right here. Check it out next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.